that UI was for that controller was very interesting because it didn't have a joystick, which was like weird at the time, but it was innovative because so the other thing I wanted to get into with students was interface UI as it pertains to video game controllers. Just because if you wanna get these students to kind of listen to you, just talk about video games and they're just tuned in full-fledged. That's just one of my tricks. Let's just talk about video games. I can get them. And I can make sense out of things. Because there's a lot of things that go into video games that you can use, that has to do with creativity. So one of those things is UI when it comes to these controllers. And I wanted to go through like a history of these controllers quickly with them, but I just didn't have time. But talking about user interface and talking about, the history of video gaming, and not to get into the history, into the blah, 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 but you think about technology, you think about Pong. So you think about the video game Pong, right? Some people may just consider that the original video game, even though it probably wasn't, but it was just kind of maybe the original like blockbuster video game that you can bring home, right? So talking about home controllers, not arcade controllers, not those kind of things. Things about arcade controllers, they're not controllers, they're machines. And then the control scheme is made specifically for one game. So you can make it very specified, right? And then you had some arcade machines where they would have the control scheme set up so you can have, multiple games in one cabinet, right? And that's more like a home machine. So, for instance, Pong came out, and you can bring it home, you can get it home, and it started off with a control scheme it was two knobs, and it was connected. There was no separate controllers, right? There was no precedent for any of this. So the initial design was two controllers, and they were rotating knobs to control the paddles for two people, right? It was kind of more like arcade where it kind of two people next to each other playing the game. And that's how they kind of say, hey, if home is just kind of try to mimic the arcade experience. But then quickly you just realize that the home experience is completely different than the arcade experience. It's a different setup. It's a different scenario, right? This person might be wanting to sit on the couch over here. This person might want to be on the floor, right? So then came the Atari. So you think about the Atari controller, and it has a joystick that's more akin to, what was an arcade. Like almost every arcade machine had a joystick at the time. You're trying to play Donkey Kong or Pac-Man. It's a joystick. And the Atari 2600 control scheme was one joystick, one button. That was it. And that the games that came out from that had to adhere to this one button scheme, which made the games, I would say simple, but the developers had to be creative with kind of like the controls they had in the game. But, just having one button and one way to move was cool, but it was like, I remember this from being little. It was just difficult did you hold it with your left hand and move the controller with your right, or did you hold it with your left and move the controller with vice versa, right? And it was weird. And then I always remember being little, I always wondered where the button was supposed to go, even though now I know it just didn't really matter. Well, it does matter where the button goes because what's up and what's down and what's left and what's right. So you had to hold it a certain way, and there was no clear indication as to what was up, what was down, right? To a kid, and then there was a cord coming out of it, so it's supposed to be coming out the top, the bottom, left, or right. So I always thought, even though I wasn't in the UI at all then, but I remember having troubles with that every time I played an Atari. I just remember that. So then you come down the line, and I remember we got it in television. We actually didn't own an Atari, but I remember, we had it in television. And we probably got it when it was old and cheap to get, but I remember us having it. And then television was interesting because that UI for that controller was very interesting because it didn't have a joystick, which was like weird at the time. But it was innovative because it was like, to have a joystick, you would think engineering wise, that's just tough. But it came with this disc that you can kind of use as a controller, and it rotated, and it was just weird, but it did work, but it was weird. But then instead of buttons, it had numbers that mimicked a phone. But what was cool about it was each game came with a slip sheet that you can slip in the controller that changed the control scheme per game. So it was almost more like PC gaming in that you can just map whatever button you need to whatever you need. You just have the full keyboard to deal with to have these certain functions. And it was a novel concept until you quickly realize that those little slip sheets get lost and get bent and get messed up easily. And, you know, hitting two buttons at once was just, I remember doing that. And I remember these sheets. And it's like, if you didn't have the sheet, it's like you couldn't play the game. Because there was no internet to go on and look it up. Like, hey, how do I play baseball? I lost the baseball sheet, so I don't really know where the buttons go and what buttons to push for what. And I just remember having a couple games where I couldn't even play because we lost the sheets. And there was no easy way to kind of find other sheets, right? And then we get into the Nintendo controller, which is the gold standard, right? For like modern home gaming is, you know, the D-pad, which is the left controller to control your character in 8 different directions, and then you had your 2 buttons and you had to reset in the start, right? That was select start. So, and I should know that because of the old Konami code, which I forget right now, but you know, it was like ABB something select start, right? And this is the gold standard. But one thing about this UI scheme, so you could tell this UI scheme was actually well thought out. And it has stood the test of time because even the modern home controllers still use a bulk of this design scheme. But I remember the controllers were very small. Like when I was younger, they didn't feel too small. But as I quickly got older and my hands got bigger, I just remember that controller just feeling small on my hands. And I remember those sharp edges, like just feeling after playing the game for a long time. I just remember it not being as comfortable. Right, and it was small, and it was uncomfortable. But I wonder how like these user tests went. I would love to see if they have any like data and stuff like on user testing these controllers. So the next system I kind of got, this is a quick story. I asked for the Nintendo for Christmas, for one of those Christmases. It was a Christmas, and it might have been out a year or two. But I remember I got it for Christmas. My mom got it for me for Christmas. But it was like the entire setup. It was the Nintendo entire setup system. I forgot what it was called, but it was like the Nintendo, the gun, Rob, which was this little robot that looked at the screen and supposedly helped you with games. And then the 2 games that came with it were Duck Hunt and Gyromite, not Super Mario Brothers. Like I never owned Super Mario Brothers, which is crazy. But those 2 games that came with it were Duck Hunt and Gyromite, and I loved Gyromite because you can use the Rob, the little robot, to help you with the game, and it would certain flashes, like the screen would flash, and then the robot would kind of interpret that flash to make it do stuff, which was like it would have to put it in this little spinning mechanism to make a disc spin. Then it could take it and like put it on these red or blue kind of levers that had the second controller. It was a lot going on. And what I appreciated about it was it was technical. It was something to put together and figure out. But ultimately, it was just too slow. So people that had the robot, almost everybody I talked to that ever had that robot, it just turned into, you took the second controller and that little lever mechanism, you just kind of started opening up these pipes. That's what the levers would do. It would make these pipes go up and down so you can get through, kind of picture like Donkey Kong look with Super Mario Brother characters, and you would just use your feet to open up these things because the robot would take so long to do it where you can just kind of push it with your foot and kind of get through the levels. And it was just a puzzle game. And the UI for that was interesting as heck. And it worked. It was just too slow, which is part of the UI, so nobody used it. So, swiftly Nintendo started offering a system without the gun or rob, and it just came with Super Mario Bros. Or something like that. But the next system I got shortly thereafter was a Sega Genesis. And, this changed my world. I feel like this is the best system in the world to me. And the Sega Genesis kind of dominated my formative video game playing years. Like as I was growing up with video games, I grew up with the Nintendo and the Sega. But as soon as I can get the Sega, I ditched my Nintendo. I sold it to a pawn shop and I got Sega, the Genesis. And that controller I loved that controller at the time because it was much bigger and it fit my hands better. It just felt more comfortable because it was rounded corners. There was no sharp edges. And, the fact that it had 3 buttons, you can make games a little more robust, right? You had another option. So you had a jump option, you had a shoot option, and you can have a change your weapons option, for instance. Whereas on a Nintendo, it would be jump, shoot, and then maybe you had to hit both of them at the same time to change weapons, right? So, but ergonomically speaking, it was just much, much more comfortable. And from a UI perspective, it lent itself to longer gameplay, right? Then came the Super Nintendo. I never owned a Super Nintendo because I was a Sega fan. I'm still a Sega fan, even though Sega is really kind of out of the hardware business. And they don't make too much software that much anymore either that comes to consoles. But then the Super Nintendo controller, it was still felt small, but at least they got rid of the sharp edges. And a lot of people call this the dog bone controller because those little indentations at the bottom tried to mimic. I would say they got the idea from the Sega, that kind of shape, that boomerang shape. That you can tell that's innovative because even the new Xbox and PlayStation controllers still have a boomerang shape. And I can attribute that to that first Sega Genesis controller. And then perfected by the 6-button controller, if y'all know what I'm talking about. But the Super Nintendo controller was dope from a UI perspective because it introduced another button. So now there was 4 buttons and they weren't just straight across so you can save space. And then they introduced 2 shoulder buttons. So it's kind of like I would love to see those UI tests when they're testing. I would love to see. They have to have some make tools, some prototypes. I would love to see all those. I should have looked that up beforehand, but how they came to this and how they with the shoulder button. So now your thumb had something to do to control. Your other thumb had the buttons, but then you can use your 4 fingers for these 2 shoulder buttons. So it just introduced more complexity. And that was a step up because now you had stuff you can do on the Super Nintendo that you really couldn't put off on the Sega Genesis because sometimes those shoulder buttons, especially for driving games and flying games, they just made sense to be up here. And Sega Genesis never came out with a controller that had that. They had a 6-button controller, but sometimes just having 6 buttons didn't make sense for something that can be up here and you can do something at the same time. Right? So anyway, I thought from a UI perspective, I think the Super Nintendo controller set the trend. That and the Genesis controller set the pace for what modern controllers at home would look like. And then came the PlayStation, right? And fun fact, I didn't jump on the Sony band. In video games back in the day, I was definitely what you would call the first adapter. I think that's the term. I was the first adapter. So as soon as a system came out and I was interested, I tried to get it, right? And I would be a advocate for it. So as soon as the Sega came out and I figured it out, I was like, I want that. And as soon as the PlayStation came out, so rewind, the Sega Saturn came out before the PlayStation. Now, the Sega 32X and the Sega CD, I didn't jump on those bandwagons because I used to get the Game Informer magazines and Electronic Gaming Monthlies and all that good stuff. And Game Pro, I was that guy. And I would just read the reviews for the Sega Saturn. So when it was announced, because I'm a Sega guy, and I was like, I'm getting the Sega Saturn. So I asked my mom, because at the time I was still in high school or about to go to college, so I was still asking my mom for stuff, right? And I was like, I want the Sega Saturn for Christmas. For Christmas, I want the Sega Saturn. And I said that early when it was just announced. So she had went on and got it. and just kind of hid it from me until Christmas for months. And as I saw the reviews coming out for it when it came out, wasn't good, and it was hard to develop for. It was expensive. It was this. It was that. And then then the Sony came out. So before she could get it, so she had bought it already, and then the Sony came out, right? And then it had just came out right before Christmas, and I had told her like, I don't want the Saturn no more. I want the PlayStation. So being the dope mom that she is, she didn't even, well, no, I rewind. I can't remember. So what happened was I got the Saturn for Christmas, but then when I got it and I was like, but I've been reading these reviews and the Sony just came out, and I was like, I can't keep this Saturn because I need to get the Sony. I feel like this Saturn isn't going to rock out for long term. So I returned the Saturn, and the Sony was sold out everywhere. So I just kind of waited and got on a waiting list and finally just got the Sony PlayStation. So anyway, the Sony PlayStation controller was, I would say a lot of people would consider this like the first modern gaming controller. Like the modern controllers pretty much look like this one. Just a precursor of it. They introduced a second shoulder button, so now you had two controllers. So now you had almost every finger on your hand utilized. At least your thumb and your forefinger and your middle fingers were controlling a different button at any given time. And it was light, and it was ergonomically, it felt good with these two kind of like extended boomerang handles. And it was just a dope controller from a UI perspective. The Nintendo 64 controller, I didn't never have the 64. I really haven't, after I went Sega, I didn't come back to Nintendo until I got a Wii, when the Wii came out. But this 64 controller, I remember playing with it, and it was very, very innovative and very, very Nintendo as far as with the colors and everything. And it kind of went the way, it kind of took tenets from the PlayStation controller with the handles, but it introduced another handle. So it's like you can hold it two different ways. You can hold it from the edges, or you can hold it if you need to, Nintendo Super Mario 64, where you needed analog. It was the first controller to have analog, right? An analog control scheme. So, and I don't know if it's analog or just like digital on steroids, but I remember you can walk with Super Mario 64. So walk or run. So it was truly analog. And you had to hold it with the middle controller and the outside. And it was kind of weird, but it was very versatile. It had the two shoulder buttons. It just had a lot going on. And, they had the fact that it had like the A and B buttons were like bigger. And then they had the other yellow buttons as a control scheme, kind of like the Nintendo. It was just like, it was trying to cover all bases for all types of games. And, ergonomically speaking, and from a UI perspective, it was a lot going on, and it had to take a lot of testing, I'm assuming, to get to this control scheme. But Nintendo always kind of innovated with their controllers, as you can see, kind of going forward. And then came the DualShock. So this is just the PlayStation with two analog sticks, and it just kind of made this controller perfect. Because this is basically the controller that exists now, even with the PlayStation 5. And it just kind of covered all bases. It had the two analogs. It had all the buttons. It had the two shoulder buttons. It just kind of, and it just felt good. And Sony hasn't really swayed from this control scheme since then, which says something. The next up, the Dreamcast. Now I'm a Sega dude, so I got the Sony, and I got the PlayStation 2 and all that stuff. But when the Dreamcast came out, I definitely got it because it was Sega. Like, sight unseen, I got it because I wanted to play Crazy Taxi. I wanted to play Jet Set Radio. I wanted to play, at the time, 2K. Like, this was when the people don't know, 2K, NFL, and NBA 2K got their start on the Sega Dreamcast. And that's the system for me. And this controller was super unique because it had a novel, like, way to save. Because before that, you really still couldn't save. Like, you couldn't save on a CD because there weren't CDRs. You couldn't save on the disc, and you really couldn't save to the machine. So you had to still save with these, like, external cards that you had to buy. But the Dreamweaver introduced a card that can go into the controller, whereas the PlayStation had these cards that had to go into the actual system. So this controller for the Dreamcast had the VMU, which was the save stick or whatever. That had a screen on it, so it can give you like little extra information depending on the game you were playing. So it was a novel concept. It didn't take hold. It never was a game breaker, but it was kind of cool. But the controller, I loved the controller because it was big, so it fit. I just have, I've always had these like long fingers, so this controller just fit me better, and it was more comfortable. But I know it was like kind of huge for a lot of people, but it just was comfortable, and that was like. But it just one thing was weird. It only had 2 shoulder buttons, and it was just weird. It was like, why go backwards? You've seen the 4-button control scheme, and I don't know if this came out before, and I'm kind of messing up my history, but it was just weird. I remember like certain games with the 2, they would come to Dreamcast, and you had to do this extra stuff to get what you would get normally from the PlayStation controller. And also, it just had 1 analog stick too. It was like Sega was just trying to do its Nintendo thing and just kind of do its own thing, but it was doing it backwards. It was doing it backwards, and the 1 analog stick, I think, hurt it where the trend was going towards 2. So then, I'm going to fly through this because I didn't own the system, the GameCube, but it kind of just kept with the theme of what Nintendo was doing. It was, it got rid of that 3rd handle, but it introduced another analog stick. But then it introduced like a different kind of control scheme, which was totally different from their previous system. And you can see this trend with Nintendo, like every controller has a different kind of control layout. It's almost like they're introducing, when they come out with a new system, it's totally new. Whereas like the PlayStation, Xbox come up with new systems, it's just like a upgrade. Whereas the Nintendo, they come out with something totally new, a different control scheme. The buttons are in different places and all that good stuff, which is, good or bad depending on how you look at it. But, definitely from a UI perspective, color is also a big deal. So definitely looks more like a game. It looks like more something that you would get at, rest in peace, Toys R Us and not Sears, for instance. And then came the Xbox, right? So now we're into the modern gaming. And the Xbox clearly took its cues from the Dreamcast controller, but it introduced, a second analog stick. And what you'll start to see with the Xbox as compared to the Sony controller, the Sony controller has the 2 analog sticks kind of in the middle, whereas the Xbox has kept their scheme where they have 1 analog stick kind of like up where normally your thumb would go, and then another one down where everybody else's is. So slight differences between the 2. The Xbox controllers usually are a little more bulky because they take batteries. But this one was just, this wasn't good. I remember this came out with the original Xbox, and the shape of the buttons, that was just terrible from the start. I remember they released a replacement controller like soon thereafter because the backlash from members like, this is whack. Like these buttons not being circular was whack, and it was just wasn't comfortable. Even though it was comfortable like size wise, it was just whack with these, and they were extra glossy and sticky. And I just assumed that they just didn't test this enough before they put it out. That's the importance of testing. Tangent. You have to test products before you put them out. And, the big corporations, this is a given, but, trying to teach the students this is like, even if you design a logo, show it to people. If you're a fashion designer, you show it to people. If you're working on a website or any kind of thing, show it to people. Have people use it. If you're working on an app, have people kind of interact with your sketches before you even move forward. Like you have to show people. It just feels like they didn't test adequately with this controller because they had to change it like immediately. Now, again, the Nintendo Wii came out with just a totally unique control scheme because it introduced motion controls, it introduced like an infrared system where you can point the controller at the TV and it can see what you're pointing at. It just introduced a lot. There was a lot going on with this controller. And I truly feel that this was an experiment to see what gamers would take to. And I think this from a research perspective, they gained a lot of research, Nintendo and others, as to what people would do. Would they actually stand up and game? Would they want to sit down more? Would they actually break things? Would they put the strap around their wrist? And it was weird. Like the analog stick was on one, the other one was meant to be the right, the buttons. But then if you played something like a vintage game like Super Mario Brothers, you can just flip that controller around, and now it's like an old school classic Nintendo controller. It was a lot going on, and it was innovative. And they didn't like make this better with the next system. They just changed it all around again. But I thought this was one of the most innovative, and it kind of shifted how controllers were looked at, especially from a company like Nintendo. But from a user experience perspective, it was cool to use. I just felt like it was just too cumbersome to just get ready to play. Instead of just picking up the controller and just start playing, it was just like, okay, I gotta get this. I gotta put this around my wrist. I gotta like point at stuff and gotta make sure that I'm at the right angle. And it was just a lot. So it just prevented me from just really jumping into the Wii games. It was like I had to plan to play Wii games. So this was pretty much the I forgot the name of this specific PlayStation controller, but I think this came out for the PlayStation 2. No, not the PlayStation 2, the PlayStation 4, maybe. I don't think it was for the 3, but for the 4, and introduced like a touch pad in the middle, which I really never used for any games. It was the games I played, I never kind of used. Oh, I didn't even own the PlayStation 4. That was during the time when I had just started teaching, and I was just busy, and I had my play kind of went down, and that generation of gaming I kind of just didn't get into. That's when I kind of stopped being a gamer. I was a gamer before then, and I kind of stopped. Still study video games, still play them, but I wasn't a gamer. I wasn't like playing every day during that period. So I missed this, but I remember reading reviews, and that whole touch thing didn't really take off at all. I think they was trying to be innovative. It did introduce motion controls in this controller, I believe, or maybe the controller before this. But the PlayStation controller has these motion. So I remember I used to play a game called Flower. In order to play that game, you didn't hit nothing, I don't think. You just kind of used this controller to kind of fly around. And I actually liked doing it. It was dope. And they clearly took inspiration from the Wii, because whenever Nintendo drops in the system, they kind of beat down Sony and PlayStation from a sales perspective. And then they were just trying like, okay, we're getting beat by Nintendo with this underpowered, toy. So let's introduce some motion stuff just like them and some innovation just to kind of compete. But it just didn't work. But the controller is still a PlayStation controller, so it's still a super great controller. And it had the rumble. It was rumble built in. You didn't have to have an extra thing, and it was pretty dope. And then you got the updated Xbox controllers. Pretty much the Xbox controller today looks just like this still, so they found its groove. One thing I did want to point out was the difference between, most controllers now have this control scheme where it's like a diamond of buttons, and the fact that Nintendo used these colors, but then the original Nintendo had A, B buttons. That's where they got, the A and B. And the Xbox kind of went that direction with the A, with the letters, and they kind of still follow when Nintendo came out back in the day, which was, A, B, and then X, Y. But the PlayStation, they've always had these shapes, and I always thought that was interesting as a differentiator, but it just seemed like they did it so it was more universal, maybe. That's what I always assumed, but when I kind of looked it up, it didn't really say that. So, shapes are more universal than letters. So if you're over in Asia and you're playing this game system, Sony is a Japanese company. Now, I might be wrong about that, but I'm assuming Sony's a Japanese company, but Microsoft is an American company. So Microsoft uses English-based letters, and the PlayStation uses shapes. So a square is a square everywhere, whereas B and A might be something. They're just shapes in other places in the world that don't know English anyway. So I always thought the shapes were cooler. But I always found it interesting that those differences and the colors they used, right, and the reasons. And one thing I did look up real quick was that the intent was the red circle was meant to be like no, or go back or something like that. That's why you usually hit that button, which is the B button on most other controllers, to go back. And then the X was meant to confirm. Like, that's why it was blue, because it's like a confirmation color, right? And usually you hit the X button to kind of progress through things. Now, the triangle and the square, they were weird when I saw the description, so I didn't really get it. But, they did have some meanings behind why they chose those shapes. So this is pretty much where we get to the, we're in the modern controls. And then the Switch, it's definitely another different kind of control scheme for Nintendo. But it's different, but it's a retro. So it's almost like two Nintendo, like classic Nintendo controllers with analog sticks. No, I'll say two Super Nintendo controllers with analog sticks. So two people can play it horizontally, together. And if one person is playing together, you can still kind of handle it like a controller, but it's a portable unit. And it's just a lot going on. But, from a UI perspective, the reviews, because I don't have this system, the reviews are all like good, because you just look at it, it's a Super Nintendo controller, and you can't go wrong with that. And then the vertical positioning, it's a modern controller. It's a modern, actually a Xbox controller, whereas you have an analog button top left, and then another analog button bottom left. And then, if you want to control with the buttons, like a more digital control, they put it below the left analog stick, and it's buttons. So if you needed to use it for buttons, you can. If you want to use it for direction, you can. I thought that was interesting. So I just think from if you want to kind of look at UI from a different perspective, that's not screen based, that's not like, based on design systems and material design, for instance, on iOS, and, user interfaces. You look at TV controllers, look at your Fire Stick controller, look at your Hulu controller, look at if you have a Samsung or, any of those with those, I would call them old school controllers now, these huge controllers with a whole bunch of buttons trying to do everything. I think those are going by way of the dodo, but, a lot of people still have those kind of controllers. Like, how do you make that comfortable? How do you make it so your grandmother can figure it out right out the backs? Now you have the TV shifts with a controller, but you need to use your Fire Stick or your Roku controller. And, I still see when I go to people's houses, they might have like 2 or 3 controllers. And that used to be me. You might have 4 or 5 controllers sitting out. One to control the stereo, one to control the TV, one to control this, one to control that. And it's clearly some people just don't know how to like merge them. But like, if you want to see like user interface, like on steroids, and how you kind of navigate through it on a physical piece, look at TV controllers, look at video game controllers, because these are meant to be tools. They're meant to do specific things, but for way differing types of games. So how do you put together the best control scheme for that? Do you kind of follow the trend and just kind of keep it consistent, like Sony and PlayStation have started to do? Or do you kind of innovate each time, like Nintendo does, right? Do you want consistency, or do you want it to be new? One thing I think about Nintendo, when you buy a new Nintendo system, it feels like you're getting a new toy, like a brand new toy that you've never played or touched before. Whereas when you buy a new PlayStation or an Xbox, it's just like you're getting an upgraded. You're getting like usually when those games come out, it's like, hey, you get the PlayStation 5, like most of the games coming out, you can play it for the PlayStation 4 and the 5 because the controllers are the same. In the case of the Xbox, I can use my old Xbox One controller to control my Xbox S, right? Because it's the same controller. They didn't innovate the control at all. They little slight innovations, kind of like when new iPhones come out. It's just still an iPhone, but it's like it has an upgraded camera, in a faster system. But it's still just an iPhone. There's no innovations going on in the hardware at all anymore. So, when it comes to UI, that's a lot of things you have to like think of that. Do you want to innovate, or do you want to, keep the control schemes the same where you don't think about the control scheme? Like that's not something you think about, or you want the consumer to think about, or the user to think about. So yeah, I wanted to go over that with the students, because it was almost like a way to demystify user interface design. It's just like, hey, you use it every day with your devices, especially your gaming controllers. And then for the PC gamers, I didn't even go over that. For the PC gamers, they play video games with a keyboard. And some of them have specialized keyboards meant to better function for games. But essentially, they're still just keyboards and mice. And it's just, I never got into that because a keyboard and a mouse to me is a work tool, not a gaming tool. And my computer and my computer monitor, when I sit down in front of a computer, I'm there to work. Like, I've never been a guy that sat down on a computer to play games or to do anything really like fun. I always sat down at a computer to work. And it's not a video game system. It's like when I want to play video games and have fun, I kind of go somewhere else. And there's another place for that. Like, I don't mix where I work with where I play. But when you introduce a keyboard, sky's the limit as far as what you can do with it. You can utilize every button on that keyboard for your game. That means your game can be super complex if you need it to be. And then you can remap and you can make it comfortable for you, right? You see gamers, e-gamers, professional gamers, they walk with their own controllers because this is that important. Or they walk with their own keyboard because they have a feel and they know where things are and they know how they've collaborated them. And it's a big deal nowadays. But back in the day when, for instance, I participated in I was in esports. I'll be talking my shit on here. Like, I was actually into esports not really, but, looking back, I was in a Madden tournament in 1992. Like, at the Ohio State Fairgrounds, I participated in a John Madden football tournament. And I also participated in a tournament, a Gran Turismo tournament when I was in college. Maybe my sophomore year in college, my sophomore year in college. And it was Gran Turismo. I was good in Gran Turismo at the time, and I participated in the Gran Turismo tournament. That's it for the day. That's my tangent for the day, or my tangents for the day. It was kind of getting back into it, just talking about this old tangent platform, the Office Hour Tangents. I had 16 episodes before. I'm going to mark that as season 1. And I'm going to begin season 2. It's a new school year. It's off the summer. So I'm going to consider this, even though it really doesn't matter, but it's like season 2. I've learned a lot and there's some ideas I want to kind of implement. Our school, they just built a new podcasting room, that's bigger, and I won't say bigger and better, but I have some ideas of what I'm gonna do in that room. So I'm interested to see what I'm gonna come up with, or the guests I'm gonna bring on, the ideas that I want to just kind of get out there with this new season of Office Hour Tangents. So thanks for listening. Especially, really, I want to appreciate those of you that have been rocking with me. It's not a lot, but those of you I do notice, they've been rocking with me, they've been watching these, because your time is valuable, and the fact that you're going to spend it watching these videos, even if it's one video, even if you watch it for 5 minutes, I appreciate it. It's dope. So, and then requisite, subscribe, share, comment, all of that good stuff. If you have any memories of video game controller memories, or things you want to add regarding UI, or things you want to add regarding 3000 in the direction he's going, leave it in the comments. Also, if you have a topic that you would like me to cover, that would be dope, because sometimes I'm like, what am I going to talk about? I would love to talk about some topics that kind of come from the comment section. So subscribe, share, comment, all that good stuff. And until next time, peace.